Hello, welcome to episode 62, PR and Politics with Anthony Hayes.
Welcome to the PR Playbook Podcast, the only podcast giving you actionable skills and advice you need to execute a strategic PR program. Warning: what you hear next may lead to brand awareness and increased sales and customer exposure. Now here's your host, Rinjini Joshua.
Speaking with the president and founder of the Hayes Initiative, a certified LGBTQ owned and operated public affairs and strategic communications firm in New York City. We're going to discuss the nuances of political and public policy in public relations. Thank you for joining me today, Anthony.
Happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, this is great because I don't really touch this side of PR that much. In the tech and startup space, we're talking about something totally different. So
Totally.
This is fun. So can you give me a history of your professional PR background and
Sure.
yeah.
Sure. I mean, I think it's sort of I'll give you sort of a run up to how I sort of got into this. I grew up in Oklahoma. I grew up in a small town called Eden, Oklahoma, and then moved to New York many moons ago, as much as I hate to say that. I sort of moved to New York with no plan and no thing. And I was sort of in my 20s having a ball and started doing work for the retail division of Ralph Lauren. And it just sort of turned into lots of PR and events work as a 20-something. And I loved working with the PR team there. They really utilized the stores. And I started volunteering for the Human Rights Campaign, which is the nation's largest LGBTQ advocacy organization on a policy level in Washington, D.C. And, we went to a lobby day in Washington, and I really sort of loved it and said to the executive director at the time, Joe Salmonese, who's now a good mentor and a wonderful friend. And I was like, hey, this is pretty great. Like, can people make a living doing this? And he goes, yeah, they could make a living. And I was like, okay, well, I think I'm going to do this. And so, when I was in Oklahoma, I never really graduated college. I was going to school and a scholarship got taken away because I made a little bit too much money. And so I hadn't finished my undergrad. And that, in my mid 20s, when I was finally deciding what I wanted to do when I grew up, I decided to go back to the new school and ended up working for the Human Rights Campaign and helped them manage their big electoral campaign in 2008. And really, I would say every role that I've had has sort of been in the communication space, or sort of like a find it from here kind of job, so to speak, right? Where there's no real roadmap, but you have to communicate something complicated or get people to buy into something complicated. Right. And then I, went through a series of jobs that really sort of continued to build on. I really cut my teeth in crisis communication. I managed media and communications for the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. And then, worked on Secretary Hillary Clinton's campaign. And after that campaign ended, I was going to join a firm. And then next thing I knew,
I know too much.
Well, it really wasn't. To be honest, I just wanted to sleep, to be perfectly frank. Like, I hadn't slept in a year and a half. And obviously, the result wasn't what I wanted, clearly. But I was just eager to go to my apartment because I hadn't seen it in a year and a half, because I'd been on the road traveling and was part of the press advance team that traveled with the secretary. So a few people said, oh, that's great. We'd love to have you run our communications again. Just let us know and we'll give you a retainer. And so I was like, oh, that's great. And, these happened, I think the election was November 8th, 2016, if I'm not mistaken. And these conversations were, 2 weeks after. And I was still like trying to figure out what I was doing. And I'm like, have I gotten any sleep yet? Not really. And a friend said, hey, you've always wanted to start your own thing. What are you doing?
Yeah.
How many retainers do you need to start a business? I was like, I don't know. How many do you need? And
as much as we'll pay the rent.
That's right, per each. And so I literally, somebody else called and said, we're looking for somebody to help us run a nationwide bus tour around not repealing the Affordable Care Act. And your name keeps coming up. And I just casually was like, no, you can hire our company. And they were like, oh, great, just send us your contracts. And I basically was like, contracts, and so that's that's how the company sort of started. And, we're 5 years later, and I feel super blessed and lucky that, all of the lots of hard work, which I think anybody in the PR space knows, it's a lot of like grinding it out. And it all paid off, and we have a great team and are very lucky. So that's sort of how we got there.
That's a good story. I like that story because it's like, I mean, I don't have, it's similar in the way like I just kind of got started and it was like, oh, you're here all of a sudden, but very
Oh, this is a
different.
business.
Yeah. Oh, it's a business. Okay. I love that you said like, oh, contract. Let me look that up real quick.
Oh, the
Uh,
worst. I was the worst.
well, okay. So I have a few questions for you
Tell me.
now that we've, gotten warmed up here a little bit. Before we dive into the questions that I originally had asked, planned for you, I kind of want to talk about getting into public policy as a person who maybe doesn't know what they want to do, or
Sure.
as a journalist who wants to transition, because I see a lot of that these days, especially with the pandemic and all the media layoffs.
Yeah.
Um, like public policy, political PR, like that seems like a really tough space. And yes, I've
It
grinded it
is.
out a lot in tech, but I don't have to be on the road. I don't have to like
Yeah.
there's no emergencies. There's no PR emergencies for me.
I'm a little jealous of that. I'm a little
Yeah.
jealous.
So I feel like you're like the only person that would have it worse than I would. Like you're in that next level and then tech is like underneath. So explain like maybe for people who want to get into it or for people who are doing political PR, we have some
Oh,
people
sure.
who are watching that are a part of nonprofit organizations that want to like advocate and stuff. What should you expect when you want to do PR specifically? What are some of the tasks that you have to do and like the kind of effort you have to put in?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think there, I was sort of like thinking this through before I got on with you today of like, tactics and tools. And, really, if you're in the PR space, a lot of the like, I guess, day to day of PR, press releases, writing, editing, taking something that's complicated and gobbledygook, as we like to say, and really
Yeah.
like saying, you understand people need to read this and you want them to read it and they want them to understand it. So I think it's those things are always whatever space you've been, whether you're a journalist or whether it's the same, right? So it's transferable. I think the difference in sort of a more crisis driven space, or really, I would probably say, maybe better said, is a timeline space, right? Because when you talk advocacy, because even in the sort of tech space, like one of our clients at one point was Airbnb, right? So we got brought on with Airbnb as a host, as somebody who loves Airbnb. I sort of understood the product, so that was always very helpful too. But in the state of New York, Airbnb was having some real
I
challenges
remember that.
around,
Yeah.
and some of the things that housing advocates were bringing up was appropriate, right? And I think it maybe was a little bit of the things where with the new platform like that, maybe it hadn't sort of dawned on Airbnb, and so they were sort of grateful to hear how like, oh gosh, well, let's clean that up, let's take that off the system, and let's put this. But then it's sort of, you have to go a little further, right? And so what you really need to do with any sort of public policy, and any of your folks who are sort of with foundations, nonprofits, and just as a background for everybody, I also managed government. I was the vice president of public affairs and policy for Gay Men's Health Crisis, which is the nation's first HIV and AIDS organization ever, that was really formed in the moments of crisis where friends were sort of showing up going, what do we do? And then it sort of formed and was the leader in HIV/AIDS response globally. So what you have to do is, like any good PR thing, you have to tell a story, and you have to tie the human element, the user, of what the policy is going to be,
Sure.
so that elected officials can understand it. And then you have to get into the tactics, right? Like a lot of what we do, and I think this is also true just generally with crisis communication broadly that we work on, is it's a little bit like Olivia Pope and Scandal, right? Like you're like, wait, what's the problem? Wait, how do I? So they want what? For example, we worked on, I did a lot of work on marriage equality in different states. And in certain states, we would be really close and have like really be at the nearly end of the legislature cycle. So for instance, in New York, typically the legislature stops in June every year and they close up. And when they're done, they're done. It's sort of like then everybody rinse and repeat. You come back the next year and you try and get your bill through.
Sure.
So the clock was ticking and it was literally, okay, what does that senator want? They want a what? And, we would literally, and it's not normal things.
Yeah.
Like, it's not sort of like, oh, don't challenge me in a primary or, it's crazy things like, we found out that someone's daughter wanted to do something in an industry. And I was literally like, get somebody over here, like from that industry, like, what are we doing?
Yes.
And so what you do is you try to figure out if it's tied to electoral or legislative, but in particular with policy, it's generally going to be legislative. Also from policy, you may have, broader like transportation stuff. Like you may have a transportation agency that's in charge of everything in your area, and they're in charge of implementing a new bridge or a new thing. And as a community person, you may be against that or for that. And how do you sort of like you have to look at all of the many components that will be impacted by the policy. And then you have to come up with tangible ways where you explain it to all the audiences, right? Like you look at the audiences. So it's elected officials who have to vote on it. What do they need to do so that they can vote and go and get reelected? Because that's really, no offense to my elected official friends, but that's all they care about.
Right.
And then the media wants to be honest and cover things the right way. And it's your job to make sure they understand the complexities of, if it's an infrastructure project, that they're not drowning in statistics when you put out a press release where they're like,
you have to make it.
What are you hiding?
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's all those like, it feels like different audiences. It feels like you have to take into account different sort of tactics with each one and make sure you bring everybody to the party to speak, so to speak, so that when there's a bill signing, everyone's standing there so that everyone feels like they got a piece of the pie. I hope that.
Yeah, no, it's a
complicated answer.
You basically need like one of those decoder things and like a sheet that like a glossary. We need a glossary for this podcast, basically.
Oh yeah, for sure. And you also like, it's also local, right? Like, so right. It's an interesting niche, and I really do love it. But you can also.
Do you hit like both the political, like the like talking to like the representative side, and then you also have to come up with a plan for the public?
Yeah, we do both.
You're doing both. Okay.
Yeah. So we bounce between, I would say, and again, with a lot of the big initiatives that we work on, we love partnerships. So like, for instance, we're regularly partnering with either just a specific government relations firm where that's their bread and butter, or we're adding maybe another communication, et cetera. But it also will those things that you just mentioned. And then for other clients, we may just have a piece of it, or, we've often gotten brought in under crisis, right? So there's a lot of our work, I would say a good 50% of our work is crisis communications or management.
Bless you.
It's definitely not for the faint of heart. It's, there's a lot of people who want to do it, but it is, you have to like it. You really have to like it.
That gives me another question. So what kind of companies, and especially because in this podcast, we have a lot of people who are marketers, entrepreneurs, CEOs, and maybe some PR people. What kind of companies need a crisis communications plan?
Oh, well, listen, I'll just say everyone should have a crisis management plan. There isn't any business, listen, I think if you're sort of like a small shop like ours, when you're in a crisis, everyone's in it, right? Because we're just a small group of people and everybody's in the war room, so to speak, right? But, I am stunned at the number of people that don't have actual crisis management plans in place for a series of things, right? So I think, for instance, if you're living in Texas right now and you're a company,
yes,
did you have everything printed out? Because maybe you couldn't access, did you have all the emergency numbers with vendors and all those things printed out because you can't access your internet? Like that is actually a thing that people, like larger scale companies, need to need to go through. If you're the communicator for that company, do you have your key media relations people? Like, do you have your key decision makers? Because if you don't have your phone, or you can't access certain things, or you can't, like, so it's understanding how you like really tackle that. But there isn't any organization that shouldn't have some form of, and it may be one page, like you may just sort of be like, okay, page one, this is our thing. And if we need a page two, we'll add it later.
Yeah.
If you're a large scale company, you need to have a significant group. You need to know who the group is. It needs to cross over departments. It probably will have to include HR, legal, like, and everybody needs to be in the war room, and you need to have decision-making processes together for these really big moments. And I don't think many people do have them.
No, yeah, I think in my career, plus I'm not crisis management focused, but in my career, I think I've created two plans, and I've been doing this for 20 years. So two
Yeah.
plans in 20 years for me. And that's like surprising because especially with all like the IP license issues and
Yes.
like all those kind of, yeah, nobody's ever asked for it. And maybe, yeah, maybe it's my job to obviously recommend it too when I feel like there's some kind of thing. I know at least a dozen that have gone through litigation because of some kind of weird lawsuit too. So only one company had a really good crisis plan. What would you say? What do you say the crisis management plan, like creation of that? What is that process like? Is it like when you're creating it, do you do it like on a project basis? Do you only do it for retainer clients? Like if someone was like, hey, I'm listening to this podcast and we need to have one, how can they get one with that? Like, is it some kind of project or how does it work?
Yeah, so we tackle that lots of ways. Like, so one, for our, we get brought on, and I would say 80+% of our business is solid retainer standard, kind of business. And then we have lots, I would say a good 20 to 25% maybe is the right number of project base. And so we can get brought in for any level of project. So for instance, like when we worked with Airbnb, that was a project.
Sure.
We did a project with Time's Up, also around sort of legislation in New York.
Okay.
But as it relates to crisis management, what we'll do for folks is we'll either, if you're a current client, when we put together a proposal, we just sort of make it clear that it's like, listen, one of the things we offer a la carte, because you're obviously not hiring us just to create a crisis management plan, work with your team, blah, blah, blah. We can do that. And you should have one.
Right.
There's also tinkering with, because a lot of people don't dust it off once they actually create it. So then when you do pick it up, it's like Bob is no longer there and hasn't been there for 10 years. You know what I mean?
I've seen something like that before. Like none of the people on the plan were there. I'm like, who are you going to go to?
Yeah, like the comms team hasn't used Cision in forever. And
Right.
now they're literally like, this is the Cision. We have critical mention. Like, why do we have, what's the login for, So it's sort of dusting off what they currently have. Or we can just get hired because somebody's smart enough to realize, like, good Lord, after what we experienced in 2020, after what we've sort of seen with natural disasters or this or that, like, I think the list of what could constitute a crisis can, go on and on. And so I think just to sort of understand, most of all, that you have brought your senior leadership together. You've thought through, like, okay, if we were in a real, whether it's legal, whether it's, a misstatement by a CEO that's now gotten national attention, or it is a pandemic, or it is like we have to shut down an entire line of our business because of a product that's harming people. Like, what are the things that might constitute a crisis and everyone's going to be different.
Mhm.
So there's no sort of like cookie cutter. Some of the elements are the same, but there's, you sort of bring it all together. And it's really that you just talk it out, because
Yeah.
if you can talk it out when you're not in crisis, then you're like, oh my God, we totally forgot to include, our investors,
Yeah.
or we forgot to include the board,
Oh,
or we
boy.
forgot to include, it's like, who knows what you forget, right?
Right.
So, which those could be key players in your management.
When you create a plan like that, how long does it typically take to get the plan down?
Well, it sort of depends on them, right? Like we put forward a very clear, like, look, these are the assumptions so that we know we can be successful for you, right? Like, we need to have these list of things. So we send over like a list, and that's sort of agreed to in the contract. So they know early on, like, what we're going to require from them in order to be successful. So that also includes times, meetings. But if everybody makes themselves available, And depending on the scale of it, I think you could probably come out with a rough draft within, 2, 3 month window that's really good and probably just needs to be polished, right? And then you're sort of like, you put it away. But if you're looking, again, it just sort of depends on the scale of your company. If you're I'm making it up. I always love to say JP Morgan Chase or like, a GE or an Amazon, right? But like that's a
You're gonna have
different.
a lot more to deal with.
Yeah, like my guess is like if you properly look at every division of the company or you properly look at the C-suite of that company and you really sort of understand it, then you're going to be like, this is probably at minimum 6 months. My guess is a year's worth of work. So that at the end of the year, you're presenting something to the C-suite and they're like, yeah, this is right. No, let's move this, or, then it sort of can become a working document. But a crisis management plan, most of all, everybody has to understand, is a working document. Like it's not like a done and dusted kind of thing.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Um, so I'm going like totally off the rails here now.
I love this. Do it.
But everything you're saying is like, I know these questions that people are going to have. Okay. So you have your document, it's a work in progress. And what about like, some of the projects that you've worked on, some examples of things that you've kind of covered? I think like I'd love to hear anything about like a crisis. Well, we all like to hear about sensational crisis. So any like cool crisis stories that you might have?
Yeah, no. I mean, without breaking confidentialities,
Yes, of
obviously, because some of the times we exist and we do things that people never knew we existed because it never became a crisis. So we do a lot of that as well. So,
or maybe like your favorite one.
Yeah, it's so. Oh my God, that's actually really hard over the course of my career. So, like at one point, I was managed media and communications at the Port Authority and reported to this incredible woman, Lisa McSpadden. And we were just sort of, the Port Authority manages all of the airports, bridges, tunnels, has the World Trade Center side. It has its own police department. It has a bus terminal and reports to 2 governors in the state of New York and New Jersey. So it is just and its annual budget is $7 billion a year, which is more than most states. So it is by nature, every single day, everyone hates you. Hates you. So between airplanes coming in with no landing gear or, terrible things like people jumping off bridges or accidents on bridges or just really unimaginable things that you can, because again, you're engaging with millions of people. But I would say the one that was really sort of the funniest now that I like sort of look back on it, and I think hindsight, this is many, many moons ago, but there was a guy who was out riding his jet ski around JFK Airport, somehow got stranded allegedly. And like, I don't really remember some of the details, but somehow ended up climbing the fence at JFK, walking across multiple runways.
Oh, wow.
And so it just sort of it took on this thing. I mean, anybody who's listening can just sort of Google JFK breach, and I'm sure you will find many, many things. Okay. But, one of the challenges is I think when you're sort of dealing with crisis is, sometimes there's things that are said about you or your organization that just aren't true. And so as a comms team, you really want to go in and push back on that and find the right way to do it so that we can't gaslight reporters. We can't sort of like go in and be like, well, that never happened. I mean, you can, but no real reporter is going to work with you. Right.
Right.
Especially on the national scene. Cause we all can have, there's some reporters out there that are pretty terrible, but like by and large, they're all really smart and professionals and really stellar at their job and want to do a good job. But I think they also get engaged with PR folks like us who come in like trying to spin the moon with them. And they're literally like, what's wrong with you? I'm not an idiot. So anyway, we had a couple of things that were just sort of not like landing, and they just we couldn't somehow like get people to understand like, well, no, wait, that didn't happen.
Right.
And so, there was a real push from various places throughout the building to like come in hot and like be like, get our attorneys and get on that, everybody gets really escalated in a crisis. And I can tell you, it's the worst possible thing you can do. One time that happened, and rather than it sort of being just because, again, this story had been dragging on for a while, like rather
Right.
than being sort of like page 4 in the corner right, it was like it became front page the next morning of a particular national newspaper.
Wow.
Um, and so you just have to like ride through it and really understand how to not get crazy. You really have to like pick the fight, and
I
it's a
think,
lot of
yeah, picking the fight is a good one.
it's a lot. Listen, I'll say this. I love crisis. I think it's great. I get why people don't like it because it is, um, chances are crisis has led to somebody doing something incorrect or
Yeah.
bad or perceived, I guess is probably a better way to say that. But,
Yeah.
so you're fighting that, and really sort of trying to be a truth teller. So
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's a really tough position to be in, but I agree with you in the fact that everyone should be prepared for a crisis. You never know, when someone's going to come after you, or
it's
you have
not if, it's not if, it's when. It's
when.
not if there's going to be a crisis, it is when will there be a crisis. And there will be, everyone assumes they're going to be fine. Everyone. Everyone crosses their fingers and they're like, this is fine, not us. What do you mean?
Yeah,
We're just an X company.
it can't happen to me.
Yeah, it does happen all the time. No one believes me. No one believes me, and it will
Oh,
happen.
that's so crazy. So I imagine in 2020, you were getting blown up like all over the place, for
Yeah.
so many reasons, right?
Yeah. Yeah, we
Um,
were.
what was it like? Like, what was it? What did you see? What what kind of requests did you see the most of? And then this is obviously from your perspective,
Oh,
but
yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, Look, I think first we really, I'll sort of speak as a business owner
yeah,
first, right? And so again, as a company based in New York City, which was in the early days of COVID, just an onslaught
like
and
crazy. Yeah.
just really I don't know, once in 100 year kind of like things that you were seeing with refrigerator trucks outside hospitals with bodies. And I mean, it was bad. So I think first and foremost, I really sort of thought to the team, right? And I just thought about like the team that I was responsible for
Right.
and just sort of made it very clear to them that I'm like, look, everybody needs to go home. We need to be in our own corners. And most of all, we're going to get on the other side of this. Everyone will have their job. Like, we're going to figure this out. Like, I don't know what this means, but we're going to figure it out. And then we just frankly had to dig in. And I would say until mid-May, we were just in nonstop sort of crisis mode, helping
Yeah, I bet.
people. We're very remote as a company already. So this was not a new sort of like idea for us.
Yeah.
So I think the fact that we had, years of sort of operating that way really did help us with our clients and really help them sort of think about.
You got to shave off that whole learning curve that everybody had.
Yeah, we didn't have any of that.
Yeah.
So and luckily we were able to give those learning things that we went through and access, we were like Zoom and they're like, what do you mean? And, cause like we forget, everyone actually forgets it wasn't really always Zoom. Like in the early days, people were like Zoom. Do I have a Zoom account? And they're
Yeah.
like going on and clicking and having to buy
Yes,
a Zoom account.
absolutely. It's like WebEx is like the party line if you have it
Totally.
because it's expensive. Yeah, no, yeah, you're right. You're
We
right.
had we had one example, and I think there's plenty. So our phone rang a lot. We did a lot of pro bono work, specifically with small businesses and really restaurants in New
Oh,
York,
that's
because
great.
the restaurant industry really sort of got slammed. And so really worked with, I don't know, probably about 25 plus restaurants to make sure they got organized, make sure they were signing onto all the letters that were going to elected officials. So their name was on the list, making sure they had access to links to PPP, making sure that they just applied as quickly as possible. And then, where we could help them with messaging, we did. But so that was one piece that we did that we were really proud of. But then on the more sort of people reaching out to us because they were in crisis, we had one group that called us who had a brick and mortar business who had never done anything, ever done anything virtual. And then all of a sudden they're like, it's all virtual and we need press. We need lots of press and we need everybody to cover us. And the CEO wants press. And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, no, I hear you. So like, since the world is on fire, what are you going to give to everyone? Because the service that you offer, the
Has nothing
service
to
that
do
we
with
were,
COVID.
well, no, it actually was in the
Oh,
mental
okay.
health space,
Okay,
right? So
okay.
it actually was a very important
Yeah.
thing. And I'm like, we could probably put together a package where we go and we present it to multiple people
Yes.
where you're partnering with said elected official to offer it for free for X number. And they're like, oh, we're not going to do it for free. And I was like, oh, okay. And they're like, but the CEO just wants to make sure we're getting national press. And I said, yeah, here's the deal. I was like, there is nothing special about it. I said, will people at Good Morning America pick up our phone call? Yeah. And then they'll laugh me out of the room because the world is on fire.
Yeah.
Regardless of your politics, like at the time we had a president that was chaotic in his communication style at best, right? Like, so I want to be like I'm not trying to get political, but it's just like, you have to look at it from a reporter's point of view.
Yeah.
A reporter's point of view was in a tsunami, right?
Yes.
And by the way, the world was on fire and there was a pandemic raging. So, but people really thought that they could become thought leaders. Like, this is like end of March, that like by April 15th,
you have
they're
nothing
going
to
be
say about COVID.
Yeah, they're going to be a national thought leader. And I'm literally like, this takes years of work.
Yes.
And I said, we can definitely get your proposals looked at, but like, I'm not a PR guy who's going to sell you on, we're going to get you coverage. Because like, I know we'll get it looked at. I know we can help you. I know I can help you with your messaging, because what I've seen so far is absolutely abysmal.
Yeah.
But like, I can't promise you press. Maybe people will, but they're just going to take your money and run. And I said, I just don't like to be that kind of guy, because I would much rather have a longer term relationship with you. Yeah. So that was what I would say the craziest request. And then beyond that, it was just taking our clients and helping them really tactically think about, one client who is incredible and we just love them so much, but just need to keep them sort of quiet, but they're a big national group. They were like, okay, so for like 2 weeks, we'll change our, I was like, gang, this is going to be longer than 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And like, I didn't understand at the time. None of us understood at the time, but it had the hallmarks of long.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
But, organizations that offer product or offer things or offer a service, I think immediately we're like, okay, 2 weeks. Okay. 4 weeks. Okay. Like, and I'm like, you're getting too short. Like, and you're also not sort of approaching this from a messaging point of view about what the people who engage with said product are experiencing.
Right.
People are terrified. They're losing their jobs. They're being furloughed.
Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody, everyone's confused. It's like, it's a big mystery. Yeah.
And on top of it, it was in a presidential election year. So it was absolutely insane.
Yeah.
So.
It was, now, I know this. But when you think about all the things that happened, it's just like, if you're right, the world was on fire. I know we all think that, but if you just go down all these little individual events, you're like, how did we survive 2020? It's like,
yeah. We put out a newsletter every month, and at the end of 2020, we usually do some sort of recap, or end of every year we do it. And at the end of 2020, we were doing our end of year recap, and we're trying to figure out like, what do we want to say? What do we want to do? And so I was like, what if we put together this like video that has like all the like headlines of like, but we break it up in this, and then we break it up in that. And then it was like, okay, well, how do we sort of like highlight Black Lives Matter in a meaningful way versus, oh yeah, and this, because like, because the last thing we would want is to be like, oh yeah, and this, because it's certainly not. And then how do we add all the COVID number? Like, so we ended up putting together this video, but it was a real struggle because there was so much. And I'm literally like, it has to be less than 3 minutes. Like 3 minutes is too long. And like, I would be like screaming at clients if they were putting out something longer than what, like I would never let a client put out a 3-minute video, but we did put out a 3-minute video of all of it.
I think we did an end of year newsletter, but like, I would just like start the video and be like, screw it. And then just have like a cat, the cat going like this.
Yeah, totally.
Just
That's basically
3 minutes.
But as communicators, look, one of the challenges is all of those leaders that are coming to us wanting us to communicate. The reality is all those people want to lead with experience and strength. And the reality is no one had experience with what we were going through in 2020. And so it was very hard to guide them and to remind them to lead with empathy. And then, I think one of the biggest challenges we're going to have in 2021 is, just the lack of trust due to misinformation. So
yeah, that was going to be my last question to you. And I think we just did not ask any of the questions I had, but okay.
I love this conversation though. So
okay, it's awesome. Yeah. We saw this stuff in 2021. We somehow acclimated as businesses, as PR people, as media. It's not great. It's obviously not great. But what do you think in 2021, as solutions come to play, how do you feel people are going to react? And what work do you think is the stuff that we have to remember moving forward?
Yeah, I think generally, my top 3 sort of suggestions for 2021 have been sort of the same for a while. And I think the first and foremost is 2021 will continue to be about crisis communications.
Yeah.
And I think that it's hard for everybody to wrap their head around that. But when you look at sort of what we're going to experience this year, number one, we're still dealing with COVID. Number 2, we're dealing with vaccine rollouts. And 3, everybody's trying to figure out a restart. So there's going to be a lot of false starts on the restarts, and you're going to have to figure out how to clean that up and message that correctly. But what we want is sort of the challenges around reopening, right? And so how do we do that properly? But that's all crisis communication work. And then my second thing is, which we've talked about, and I can't tell you how happy I am that we talked about it, is just make sure you have updated or created a crisis management plan that reflects the lessons learned from 2020. Because I think there are a lot of lessons learned. And I think what's critical around creating a crisis management plan is you need to get together now, right now, so that you can unpack that while you remember it. Because look at how difficult it was for us to just sort of run down. And we were only talking from March to the end of the year, really.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important to really take what worked, what didn't work, et cetera. And then I think the biggest thing that we always try to explain to people when they go into crisis, and the last thing for 2021, is determine how much the disruption and crisis has provided opportunities for you to communicate your values and to accelerate decision-making. Because I think that's one of the biggest things that I think people forget, is that COVID has accelerated the good and bad. So how do you keep that? How do you apply that? But it's also created disruption. And so the reality with any disruption, while it's uncomfortable, it's been unimaginable, the idea that we've crossed, over 500,000 people who've died from COVID in the United States of America. But the idea that how do you as an organization or a communicator use that to speak to your values, to speak to who you are, to speak to progress? Because people, I think, are really eager to hear messages of hope, messages that are concrete, and messages that give them a sense that we are really moving into what, God willing, is a recovery.
No, I think those are amazing points. I think that's a great viewpoint. And I agree. People just want to reset and gain back some of that normalcy and just feel like there's something good out there.
Yeah, for sure. They want to get their kids back to school, for crying out loud,
Yeah. I don't know if I don't know if they're going back to school. I don't, we've been virtual. My husband's like, we're just going to homeschool. I'm like, oh, okay.
You're like, are we?
Up with that.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, okay. This is great. This is so much amazing information. I'm just gonna look at my questions real quick. So, is there anything? We didn't even cover the LGBTQ stuff.
Oh, sure.
There's just the first thing I wanted to know, and let's just go ahead and go for it. What does it mean to be certified?
Oh, sure. So the National Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce, who are incredible, really created an LGBTQ certification. It's a distinction for small businesses that are majority owned, managed, operated, and controlled by LGBTQ individuals. And it really helps them stand out when they're competing for business. Okay. So for example, Mayor de Blasio, the mayor of New York City, just joined other municipalities across the country to announce that New York City will include the LGBTQ distinction in what is now distinguished as minority women business enterprise distinction.
Gotcha.
So that helps all small businesses, most importantly, diverse businesses, compete for these big contracts, which is great because, really what you've sort of seen is a real eye for that moving forward. And frankly, what for a lot of vendors that are sort of listening to your podcast, the reality is a lot of these contracts require a certain number of jobs hired toward MWBE. So that's sort of the distinction.
Okay. And I mean, I imagine there was a lot of stuff again going on in 2020. What kind of like when it comes to LGBTQ and like any kind of advocacy, I'm assuming that's kind of where you play. What kind of campaigns did you guys work with? Or I guess more so, what kind of organizations would come to you with help with a plan around that?
Yeah, so in 2020, we really sort of, in terms of LGBTQ advocacy, so there's the Human Rights Campaign, which is an organization that I know and love, and then there's lots of others sort of around the country. We didn't actually play a lot in sort of that advocacy space in 2020. I mean, it was such a strange year in terms of legislatures and legislation moving versus not, and budgets and all of those kinds of things, which is where you can really impact policy. But what we have typically done in the past is we would work with that organization to sort of create a plan as it relates to, just to sort of give you an example, if you rewind to 2008 when I was working for the Human Rights Campaign, we focused in 2008, which was an electoral year, on increasing fair-minded majorities across the country. And while we focused on what would be typical battleground states like Ohio and Florida, we also focused on the state of New York because we knew in 2009 what we wanted to do was to have a marriage equality bill go through the legislature and have the legislature vote on it. And if we had more fair-minded people elected, then it increased our likelihood of winning. And so that's really where you saw sort of 2009, 2010, that's where you saw some really big LGBTQ legislation where Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed by President Obama. And you had a number of significant marriage equality wins legislatively. And you really would want to do those kinds of things legislatively. Like while you may have a governor or mayor or president who might want to do an executive order, the next person can just erase the executive order. You would really ideally want to have it done through the legislature or through the courts, because then it sort of is a more binding and lasting change.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Wow, you like have done so much, and I love that you didn't, you didn't graduate in a degree. Was it when you went back? Did you get a journalism degree, or what did you get?
A political science degree. So I finished my bachelor's
Okay.
and got a political science degree at the New School University in New York City.
Yeah.
So,
Okay. So I mean, it sounds like it's really cool. I like your little like your journey. It's not little, but your journey. Because mine, like, I went to school for public relations. I graduated. I got an internship. I really did like the. I'm like one of the few people that I know that like went to school for something and actually did it so far their whole entire career. And I love it. So
yeah.
it's great. But I like your journey is like, and I feel like a lot more people are having this journey of, hey, this is something I'm really passionate about. How am I going to get my foot in the door? Where am I going to play in the sandbox? And like it sounds like you had a really great experience of being able to figure that out. And had all the right, like, I guess, I don't know if they're internships, but all the right jobs. And how would you recommend someone kind of find out what they want to do that way?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think the thing that I always tell people, especially sort of younger people, is, I just said yes to everything, to be really
Right.
honest with you. So like and when I first started doing sort of policy advocacy work, it was certainly not through the lens as like a communication government relations professional, right?
Sure.
It was as an advocate. It was as somebody that I cared about it. And so I would say to anybody who's interested in doing, as it relates to advocacy in particular, there are nonprofit organizations out there that you can go and be a part of that and learn and understand and sort of join them in probably their electoral effort, or really what a lot of nonprofits are going to be fighting for in particular is around budget dollars, right? Just because everybody's suffering around that. So that's really where you can have a lot of impact on policy. But I would say broadly, anybody who's in the PR space, or maybe journalists who are wanting to sort of maybe move more into policy PR or policy communications, I think it's understanding that policy communication work really it doesn't have to be with government. Like you could go and do government relations for, if you want to, a bank, or you could go and do government relations for Airbnb, or you could go and do government relations for this. But I think just sort of like thinking about how there was a couple of reporters that I worked with when I was at the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey who came over and were working as sort of like media people, as press people. And so they sort of went from, the side of the pen and pad to the other side where they're sort of like answering the questions with the people who are holding the pen and the pad. So I think there's lots of ways to get in, but I definitely would say my journey has just been to say yes. And so when I got a job, somebody called me and said, we really need somebody strong to do a project at the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. And I happened to be free. And I was like, yes. And I just went there. And I know it sounds cheesy, but like being that person who rolls up and is, you need to have some skills. Like, I don't think you can be skillless. Like, I want to be very clear.
But you're ready to go.
But it's a real job. But you do need to go up and also just be somebody who everyone enjoys working with. Try to be as nice as you can along the way, and say yes to stuff, and maybe sort of say yes to stuff that isn't exactly in your job description, but it gives you something a little bit extra. And I think just sort of to roll up and just jump in. But there's lots of volunteer ways. If you're currently in a job and you want to sort of like feel around, I would recommend that. And talk to people, reach out to people, because people, I don't know, at least in my experience, what I've experienced more about 2020 is people want to network. So I think if there's somebody out there who's doing it, and Lord knows if anybody who's listening wants to, find me on LinkedIn, and I'm more than happy to chat anytime. So
all his information will be in the show notes. So we'll have all that stuff down.
I love that.
But yeah, I mean, I feel like this podcast oftentimes, I know it, but it becomes a little bit of a business development or like a career podcast, because public relations touches so many different elements of business.
That's right.
So, I think that's why I've always been like really happy that I went into it, was because I feel like I could do anything, it's like
100%.
Right.
100%. I mean, you're always in the room when there are decisions being made, because everybody wants to know the comms perspective.
Right. Exactly.
Like, how will this play? How will this play? And so you're always sitting there with, C-suite and decision makers, because they're like, do you think? And I'm like, no, you can't say that. So it's fascinating.
I usually, unfortunately, I get a lot of apologies. Sorry, Ranjini, I didn't mean to say that. Yeah, of course. Okay. Thank you. Let me go clean it up now.
And here's the thing. Everyone thinks they can do comms. Everybody thinks they can do comms, and they cannot. Let me just say, for the non-comms people listening, you cannot do it. There's a reason there are professionals. Like, please just listen to the professionals.
Yes. No, yes. Thank you. I didn't say it. That was Anthony. Anthony said it for us all.
It's my pleasure.
So, last question, so we could wrap this up. What is your favorite thing about what you do?
I love fixing things. Like, I really do. I know it's like, I make that some of my friends call me Oliver Pope, because I really do just sort of like, the things we get roped in to are sometimes wonderful and sometimes terrible, but I enjoy being a connector. I enjoy coming up with solutions that seem like there was no real solution. And it's just, I think it's probably the best part of the job when something's about to be announced, no one else knows, and it's that sort of secret sweet spot right before everybody, it's going to be. And I've been very lucky in getting to do it for some really big things, and where it's been really like huge news, and there's no greater high, I guess. Maybe I've never done drugs, but that's like my drug high, right? Is that like
Well,
right before.
you have endorphins coming out.
That's right. That's right. That's exactly right.
That's amazing. Thank you for all of this information and time. I mean, I think
This was so
is
great.
really such a great area of PR that's really, really interesting. Maybe if I did it again, I might probably choose differently.
Anytime, we're here.
If only I knew the things I know now, right? Like it's
Totally.
just but thank you so much. All of his information, Anthony's information will be in our show notes. You'll get a transcript. So check it out there. You can find Anthony on LinkedIn and we'll have that information as well. So thank you so much, Anthony.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This was awesome. I appreciate it.